The year was 1912. A quiet village, tucked away from the chaos of modern cities, lay still beneath the shadow of history. Horses clattered across cobblestone streets. Lamps burned dim against the cold dusk air. And in the heart of this forgotten place, a single photograph was taken, a family portrait that should never have existed. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. A mother, a father, and their children posed stiffly before the wooden frame of their small home. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy from the long exposure of the camera lens. To anyone unknowing, it looked like countless other old photos of the era. Yet something within this one was different. Something that whispered of a hidden truth. Look closely at the photograph. At first, you see only the family, strange but harmless, stiff but familiar. But then, the shadows. Between the father's arm and the youngest child's shoulder, a faint outline emerges. Too sharp to be dismissed as dust. Too human to be dismissed as trickery. A figure that shouldn't be there. This was not the first unsettling image of its kind. The early 20th century was haunted by the rise of post-mortem photography, portraits of the dead posed as if alive, taken by grieving families unwilling to let go. Yet this picture was different. No one was meant to be missing. No one was meant to be dead. And yet, the photograph seemed to tell a darker story. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered the family was cursed, burdened by a sinister past. Others claimed the face in the photograph belonged to a vanished child, a sibling whose existence had been erased from records. The villagers spoke in forbidden language, hinting at things best left unspoken. Tales of haunted places, of strange families who kept chilling secrets behind closed doors. The photographer himself would later confess unease. He had felt a heavy air while setting up his camera that day. The youngest child grew restless, tugging at his mother's dress, whispering words the photographer could not understand, a language old, forgotten, and forbidden. By the time the shutter clicked, he swore he heard a second voice, not one of the living. What makes this story unsettling is not just the eerie details within the image. It is what followed. The portrait became a disturbing relic in the village. Some claimed it was cursed, others swore it foretold tragedy. The family, once ordinary, became the subject of whispers, their home watched from a distance, their children eyed with suspicion. It was as though the photograph itself had changed them, like it had captured more than just their likeness. The world of 1912 was steeped in superstition. Old customs still clung to life, as the modern age crept in reluctantly. People believed photographs could steal souls, binding fragments of the living and the dead onto fragile paper. To some, this portrait was not merely unsettling history. It was evidence, proof of something lurking just beyond the reach of the human eye. And yet, the most chilling part is what no one dared say aloud. The family swore there had been only 5 of them standing for the photograph, but the image revealed 6. Who then was the extra figure? Some believed it was a child who had died in infancy, returned through the photograph. Others whispered of a stranger, a drifter who had once vanished near the family's land. A few went further, claiming the figure's face shifted each time you looked at it. One day, the lost infant. The next, a faceless blur. And then something darker. The photograph became an unsolved mystery. A disturbing image passed from one hand to another, studied by candlelight, feared and yet impossible to forget. The villagers avoided the family. The children, once laughing in the fields, began to vanish indoors, their windows shuttered. It was said that strange sounds echoed from their house at night, laughter when no one was awake, footsteps pacing when the family slept. This was only the beginning. What happened in the months that followed would turn the village's whispers into screams, and the portrait into a legend etched in dark history. A legend that carried with it eerie details, mysterious disappearances, and a chilling secret that would never be erased. For in that quiet year of 1912, a single family portrait became a doorway to a sinister past. A reminder that some images were never meant to be taken, some truths were never meant to be seen. And soon, the village would discover the cost of looking too closely at the photograph that should not exist. The family in the photograph was not extraordinary. At least, not at first glance. They lived in a modest home at the edge of the village. Their names are recorded in faded documents, spoken only in whispers now, but in 1912 they were known simply as the Wiltons. Thomas Wilton, the father, was a quiet man of 37. He worked the land with calloused hands and seldom spoke to anyone outside his household. His neighbors said he was dutiful, but strange. He never attended the tavern, never joined in the communal gatherings. When others laughed, he stood silent, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting something, or someone, just beyond the fields. His wife, Margaret, was softer, but equally unsettling in her own way. She was known for keeping to herself, rarely venturing into the town except for necessities. She often carried a locket around her neck, clutched tightly as though protecting something sacred. Some claimed it contained a lock of hair, but not from any of the children still alive. Their children were 3 in number, or so people thought. Alice, the eldest at 13, was pale and withdrawn, prone to fainting fits that doctors dismissed as nerves. Henry, aged 9, was energetic, though neighbors said he spoke too often to things that weren't there. And then there was Clara, the youngest at only 5 years old, with a habit of humming to herself in the garden, always turning her head as if listening to someone just out of sight. The Wiltons seemed like any other strange family, until one detail began to surface. There had once been another child. A fourth, born between Henry and Clara, an infant whose name had slipped from memory. Some said the baby had died only days after birth. Others whispered the child had lived a few years before suddenly vanishing without explanation. The truth was never written down. The records are gone, but the neighbors remembered the crying. And then, one day, silence. It was this hidden history that gave the family an aura of unease. The villagers, steeped in superstition, began to wonder if the child had truly died, or if something else had happened. Something darker. In a town where every death was mourned with post-mortem photography, there should have been a picture. Yet no such image of the missing child was ever found. It was as though the infant had been erased, forgotten, lost in time. And so, when the family gathered for their portrait in 1912, suspicion was already in the air. Margaret's eyes looked tired. Thomas's posture stiffened, as though the act of standing for the camera pained him. Alice looked pale, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but dared not. Henry's gaze wandered past the lens, his mouth half-formed in a whisper to someone unseen. Only Clara smiled. A faint, eerie smile. Directed not at the photographer, but at the empty space beside her. The photograph captured more than just faces. It froze a moment heavy with chilling secrets. It showed a family tied not only by blood, but by silence. And it revealed something else, a presence they had all learned not to mention aloud. Some believed the Wiltons were cursed. Their land, after all, sat near the ruins of an abandoned chapel, a place children avoided, claiming they heard voices speaking in a forbidden language, words that made the air colder. Others whispered that Margaret descended from a line of women accused of witchcraft, though no records remained to prove it. Still, there was something about the Wiltons that set them apart. They lived on the edge, not just of the town, but of what people considered normal. The disturbing photograph, taken that year, seemed to expose this hidden truth. The extra figure, pale and watchful, was more than an error. To the villagers, it was the missing child. The vanished one. A child that should not have been seen again. And yet, there they were, captured in the frame, standing among the living. But the portrait was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, strange incidents began to plague the family. Objects moved in the house at night. Neighbors swore they saw more children playing in the garden than the Wiltons actually had. And Clara was often found speaking softly into the dark, as though sharing secrets with a companion no one else could see. The family tried to ignore it. They tried to dismiss the whispers, but the photograph had already spoken. It had revealed something they had buried, and what was buried would not stay buried for long. The year was 1912, And while the world beyond was changing with machines, telegraphs, and electric light, this village remained lost in time. Its people clung to old beliefs, rituals, warnings, and stories whispered by firelight. To outsiders, it was merely an isolated rural community. But to those who lived within its crooked streets and shadowed alleys, the town was alive with unseen forces. Superstition was not just folklore. It was law. Doors were locked at sundown, mirrors were covered after deaths, and photographs were treated with suspicion. Some believed a camera could not only capture the image of a soul, but disturb the dead themselves. That is why every family knew of post-mortem photography, a final portrait taken with a loved one who had passed. It was a grieving ritual, an attempt to preserve what time would soon erase. But the Wiltons' portrait was different. It was not taken after death. It was meant to mark life. And yet, the figure in the photograph suggested something else entirely. The villagers, already steeped in fear of disturbing images, recoiled when they saw it. At first, they spoke cautiously, avoiding the subject in public. But at night, the whispers grew louder. They called the Wiltons a strange family, marked by chilling secrets and a sinister past. Some believed their land was cursed, for it bordered the ruins of a chapel where monks once spoke a forbidden language and rituals no one dared to repeat. Children were warned not to wander near the Wiltons' home. Some disobeyed, and those who did returned pale, unsettled, insisting they had seen an extra child in the windows. A child who smiled but never moved her lips. A child who stood in the shadows, her face blurred like the edges of an old photograph. The town carried with it older fears too. They remembered vanished children from years past, disappearances never solved, names that faded from records as if deliberately erased. They remembered haunted places just beyond the fields, where wooden crosses rotted, and the earth was said to whisper when you pressed your ear to the soil. These stories formed the backbone of their lives, and when the Wilton portrait surfaced, it confirmed every dark suspicion they had carried in silence. It was more than an image. It was proof. Soon, fear transformed into something darker. Rumors became accusations. Was the family hiding the truth of their vanished child? Had Thomas or Margaret committed some unspoken sin that invited this haunting? Or was the photograph itself cursed, a relic that tied the Wiltons to forces beyond comprehension? The photographer who took the image vanished from the village shortly after. His diary, found years later, hinted at why. He wrote of the day he entered the Wilton home, of how the air grew heavy as he arranged the camera. He swore he heard Margaret humming a lullaby while no child moved her lips. He wrote of Henry whispering to the empty space beside him, and of Clara smiling at someone, who stood where no one should have stood. The villagers never saw the photographer again. Some believed he left to escape the weight of what he captured. Others believed something followed him from that house, and that his disappearance was no accident. By this time, the Wiltons' presence had become unbearable for the townsfolk. Men avoided speaking to Thomas. Women whispered that Margaret's locket contained not hair, but ashes, and the children, Alice, Henry, and Clara, were seen less and less, kept inside, hidden from view. But at night, passers-by swore they heard voices behind their shutters. Too many voices. More than a family of 5. The town began to change in response. Doors were locked earlier. Lamps burned longer. And a silence fell across the streets when the Wiltons walked by. It was as if the village itself rejected them, marking them as outsiders in their own home. Still, the portrait remained. Passed from hand to trembling hand, studied by candlelight, its eerie details scrutinized. Some claimed the hidden figure's eyes followed you if you stared too long. Others said its face blurred into different forms, shifting each time you looked. But one thing never changed, the undeniable truth that there was someone in the photograph who should not have been there. Fear turned into obsession. People gathered in small groups, whispering theories. They compared the portrait to older disturbing images from the 1800s, known as spirit photographs. But while most spirit photography could be explained as trickery or double exposure, this one was different. The Wiltons' portrait carried with it an energy, a weight, a presence that seemed alive. The town, already haunted by superstition, began to feel the presence too. Strange knocks at night. Children waking with nightmares of a pale figure standing at their bedside. A sense of being watched, especially near the Wilton land. And then the first tragedy struck. The year was 1912, and the man behind the camera was named Samuel Archer. He was no stranger to portraiture. For more than a decade he had traveled from town to town, capturing stiff, fragile moments in the lives of ordinary families. His camera, heavy and mechanical, was both his livelihood and his burden. He had seen grief etched into faces, had posed the dead for post-mortem photographs, had preserved what was meant to fade. But nothing he had encountered before compared to what happened in the Wilton home. Archer kept a small notebook, the kind photographers often use to record times, exposures, and names. But what he wrote about the Wiltons was different. His words, later discovered, trembled with unease. He described the day as unusually heavy. The light seemed dim even at noon, as if the clouds hung lower than the sky allowed. When he entered the Wilton house, he felt a draft, though every window was shut. He set up his equipment in the yard, the family arranged stiffly before him. And yet, before the shutter even clicked, he noticed something. The children were restless. Clara hummed to herself, staring at the empty air beside her. Henry whispered under his breath in a tone too soft to follow. Alice stood rigid, eyes wide, as if she saw something approaching from behind the photographer's shoulder. Margaret clutched her locket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. And Thomas simply stared at Archer, not with curiosity, not with nerves, but with a hollow expression that made him feel watched, studied, weighed. Archer hesitated. He adjusted the lens, checked the focus, and felt his chest tighten. He wrote later that the air seemed to hum, as though the camera itself recognized what it was about to capture. Still, he took the photograph. The shutter opened. The light burned into the glass plate. And in that instant, Archer swore he heard something. Not the voices of the Wiltons. Not the sounds of the street or the creak of wood. It was a whisper. A faint, forbidden language that seemed to seep from the very air around him. A voice neither male nor female. Neither near nor far. He could not understand the words, but the tone chilled him. It was the sound of something that did not belong. When the photograph was finished, Archer packed quickly. He avoided the Wiltons' eyes, especially the children's, but Clara reached out as he passed. She touched his sleeve and whispered, "Don't leave her behind." He never forgot those words. Later, in the darkroom, Archer prepared the glass plate. As the chemicals spread and the image emerged, his hand shook. The family appeared, blurred at first, then sharpening into familiar shapes. But slowly, too slowly, another form came into view. Between Thomas and Clara, faint yet undeniable, a face emerged. Archer dropped his tools. He backed away as though the figure might step out from the photograph itself. It was not a trick of exposure. He had seen double plates before, had witnessed accidents with light and time. This was no accident. The figure's features were too deliberate, its outline too sharp. It was a child. Eyes too dark. A mouth that formed no expression. And yet, Archer felt its gaze fixed on him. The more he stared, the more details unsettled him. The figure's clothing did not match the Wiltons'. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if posed in death rather than life. Its hands appeared blurred, as though reaching. Archer realized with horror that he had seen this before, not in life, but in post-mortem portraits. The Wiltons had not posed with the dead that day, and yet the dead had appeared. Archer recorded his fear in his notebook. He wrote of sleepless nights, of the sense that the photograph followed him, that the figure lingered at the corner of every shadow. He considered destroying the plate, yet something stopped him. Curiosity, or perhaps dread. He left the village soon after. No one saw him again. Some said he abandoned his trade. Others whispered he carried the cursed photograph with him until the end of his days. What became of him is uncertain, but his notebook was found decades later in a locked trunk, its pages stained and brittle. The final line he wrote, Just beneath a sketch of the Wilton portrait, read only, "She is not theirs. She is mine now." And with that, Samuel Archer vanished, like so many others tied to the Wiltons' haunting image. But the photograph did not vanish with him. It remained, and what it revealed next would plunge the entire village into fear. At first glance, the portrait seemed ordinary. A family of 5, their clothes stiff and formal, their faces pale in the fashion of the time. The father, Thomas, stood rigid, one hand placed on his son's shoulder. Margaret clutched her locket, her expression unreadable. Alice stared forward, lips pressed tight, while Henry leaned uneasily against his mother. And Clara smiled faintly, her eyes fixed not on the camera, but on something beside her. It was only when the photograph was studied more closely that the unease began. At the far edge of the frame, half hidden between Thomas's arm and Clara's small body, was a face. Blurred, pale, impossible. The villagers leaned in to see it. At first they thought it might be a mistake, a trick of shadow. But the longer they looked, the harder it was to deny. The child's face, staring out from the print, too distinct to be dismissed. Not posed. Not alive. The details were unsettling. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like the broken necks in post-mortem photographs. The mouth hung slightly open, as though caught mid-breath or mid-scream. The eyes were deep, shadowed, yet fixed directly on the viewer. This was no blemish of the plate. This was something captured that should never have been there. The Wiltons insisted there had been only 5 of them standing that day. But the image showed 6, and so whispers began. Some villagers claimed it was the lost child, the one who had died in infancy, or perhaps lived longer before mysteriously vanishing. Others argued it was not a Wilton at all, but someone else entirely, a forgotten child from the village's own disturbing history. There were tales of vanished children in past decades, names missing from records, graves unmarked in the cemetery soil. Could one of them have returned in the photograph? The more the image was studied, the stranger it became. By candlelight, some swore the figure shifted. One night it appeared as a young boy, hair falling across his forehead. Another time, the face blurred into something unrecognizable, more shadow than flesh. A few even claimed its eyes followed them, alive with a hunger no photograph should possess. Soon the portrait was no longer just a picture. It became a relic of fear, passed around like contraband, studied in silence, hidden away as though its presence alone could summon tragedy. Children were warned not to look at it. Mothers crossed themselves before touching it, and yet no one could resist. The photograph drew them in. It demanded to be seen. It carried with it the weight of old superstitions. The belief that cameras could steal souls, that photographs could bind the living and the dead together. Some whispered that the Wiltons had invited this, through secrets, through sins, through ties to forbidden language spoken long ago in the ruins of the chapel near their land. Others claimed the family was innocent, that the photograph itself was cursed, a dark object that carried with it a sinister past. But as the weeks passed, one thing became clear. The image was not just strange. It was dangerous. Henry began to change. He spoke more often to the empty air. Villagers overheard him whispering to someone unseen, his words filled with an eerie calm. Clara's laughter grew unsettling, too sharp, echoing when no one else laughed with her. Even Alice, the quiet one, confessed to a neighbor that she sometimes saw the other child at the foot of her bed. The family denied it at first, but their eyes told another story. Margaret's face grew hollow. Thomas's silence deepened. And soon the neighbors noticed they rarely left the house at all. The Wiltons were withdrawing into themselves, as though the figure in the portrait had followed them out of the image and into their home. What unsettled the villagers most was not the eerie figure itself, but the way it seemed to grow stronger. The longer the photograph existed, the more its influence spread. Like a sickness, like a curse. And then came the night when someone claimed to see the face not in the portrait, but in the window of the Wiltons' house. The year was 1912, and by now the photograph of the Wiltons had become more than an unsettling image. It was a mirror through which whispers seemed to seep. Whispers of the dead. The first to hear them were the children. Henry was seen crouching in the fields, speaking softly to no one. When asked who he spoke to, he answered plainly. The other boy, Clara, the youngest, began to hum lullabies no one in the family claimed to have taught her. The tunes were strange, like echoes of a forbidden language, rising and falling in tones that made the hair on the neck stand upright. Alice, pale and withdrawn, confessed to a neighbor that she heard someone calling her name in the night, someone who never showed themselves, but who always sounded like family. Inside the Wilton home, the atmosphere grew heavier. Neighbors who visited reported that the house smelled faintly of damp earth, though no water leaked through the walls. They described hearing footsteps upstairs when no one was there, and the sound of breathing in the corners of empty rooms. Margaret's locket was clutched tighter than ever, her lips pressed to it as though it alone could shield her from the unseen presence. And still, the photograph remained. The disturbing image was passed in secret among the villagers, studied by flickering candlelight. Each time it was examined, the whispers seemed to grow louder. Some swore they heard faint voices while staring at it, murmurs that could not be explained by the creak of wood or the hiss of flame. One woman claimed the whispers spoke of things that hadn't yet happened, illness, storms, and deaths that came true within days. The town, already haunted by superstition, began to fracture under the weight of the image. People feared the Wiltons more openly now. Children were pulled away when they passed on the road. Men spat when Thomas walked by, muttering about bringing the dead into the village. Women avoided Margaret's eyes, whispering that she had called something into her home and trapped it in the photograph. But the whispers were not confined to the Wiltons' house alone. They bled into the town itself. Farmers tending their fields swore they heard children crying in the wind, though their own little ones slept safely indoors. A group of boys who dared to sneak near the ruined chapel returned shaken, claiming they heard chanting from beneath the earth. And one night, a midwife claimed to see the blurred face from the Wilton photograph reflected in the water of her wash basin, staring at her with hollow eyes. Fear spread quickly, but curiosity lingered. A few men tried to debunk the portrait, claiming it was a trick of exposure. They demanded to see the original plate, to prove the sixth figure was nothing more than error. But Samuel Archer, the photographer, had already vanished, taking his notes, and perhaps the original negative, with him. What remained was the single print, and with each passing week it seemed to grow more sinister, its presence heavier, as though something inside it was struggling to escape. And then came the night when the whispers turned into something louder. Henry woke screaming, his voice cutting through the village silence. Neighbors rushed to the Wiltons' home, but Thomas barred the door, refusing to let anyone in. Those who stood outside swore they heard the sound of more than one child crying inside the house. More voices than there were children. Some said they heard laughter too, a cruel, sharp laughter that echoed unnaturally, rising above the sobs like the mocking of something unseen. The family grew gaunt in the weeks that followed. Thomas stopped working the land. Margaret was seen at the chapel ruins, kneeling in the dirt, whispering prayers no one recognized. Alice rarely left her bed. Clara began to draw faces in the dust, faces of children no one knew. And Henry, when pressed, admitted something no one wanted to hear. "They're here now," he whispered. "They're inside the house." By this point, the villagers had stopped debating whether the portrait was cursed. They were certain. It was not only a photograph, but a doorway, and whatever had entered through it was now among them, whispering, watching, waiting. The townsfolk kept their distance, but they knew something darker was coming, and soon the whispers would no longer be ignored. The year was 1912, and the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. The Wilton home, once filled with the ordinary sounds of life, pots clattering, children laughing, Thomas sharpening his tools, was now saturated with something else. Silence broken by weeping. Voices that came from no visible mouths. A creeping sense of dread that seemed to thicken the very air. Then came the tragedy. It began with Alice, the eldest daughter. She had been growing weaker for months, her skin pale, her hair losing its shine. One morning, Margaret found her sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open, whispering a string of words in that strange, forbidden language the children sometimes hummed in their sleep. Her lips moved quickly, her voice urgent, as though she were repeating instructions. But when Margaret demanded to know what she was saying, Alice could only shake her head and whisper, "They said it's not for you." By nightfall, Alice was gone. Her body lay unnaturally still, her lips slightly parted as if caught mid-breath. There was no sign of illness, no fever, no struggle. She had simply slipped away, taken, as many whispered, by whatever lived inside that portrait. The Wiltons buried her in the churchyard, though few dared to attend. Those who came claimed the soil smelled of iron and that the air around the grave was colder than anywhere else in the yard. Some swore they saw a second shadow cross Alice's face in the coffin, faint but unmistakable, as though something had been buried alongside her. The family's grief was unbearable, but grief soon turned to terror. Within days, Henry began to suffer. He no longer spoke to his parents, but instead carried long conversations with the other boy, the shadowy figure from the photograph. Margaret pleaded with him to explain what the boy wanted. Henry only smiled faintly and whispered, "He wants me to come play." And then, Henry vanished. The disappearance was sudden and absolute. One evening he was seen in the field, crouched in the tall grass. The next morning his bed was empty. No footprints, no broken fences, no trace of him anywhere. The town searched every barn, every ditch, every corner of the woods. But Henry had been swallowed by the silence. The second grave was never filled because there was no body to bury. Only a marker stood beside Alice's headstone, carved simply with his name, Henry Wilton, a gravestone for a vanished child. By now the Wilton household had become a place of terror. Clara would not sleep alone, trembling and whimpering whenever night fell. Margaret was gaunt, her once bright face hollow, clutching her locket as if it could keep the shadows at bay. And Thomas was broken. Once a strong man, his shoulders now sagged under the weight of failure and fear. The other villagers avoided him, convinced his stubbornness had cursed them all by refusing to destroy the photograph. But Thomas had his reasons. In his heart, he believed destroying it might unleash whatever was trapped inside, that it might set it free. The portrait remained hidden in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, yet its presence filled the house like a sickness. Margaret confessed to hearing the sound of Alice's voice calling from the drawer at night, her words muffled but desperate. Clara swore she saw Henry's face reflected in the window glass, smiling at her when no one else was there. And still, the photograph endured. The townsfolk grew restless. Superstition spread like fire. Some demanded that the house be abandoned, even burned. Others insisted that Margaret was practicing some forbidden ritual to keep her children tied to her even in death. The whispers of the dead, once faint, were now part of every conversation in the village. The tragedy of the Wiltons had become their neighbors' nightmare as well. Fields went untilled. Families locked their doors. At night, the streets were deserted, as though the entire town had been swallowed by the same darkness that had taken Alice and Henry. And then came the breaking point. One night, Clara woke screaming. Her voice cut through the stillness of the village, shrill and terrified. Neighbors claimed it sounded as if dozens of voices screamed with her, a chorus of the dead. When they rushed to the Wiltons' home, they found Thomas kneeling in the dirt outside, his face buried in his hands. He would not look up. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. Inside, the house was silent again. Too silent. And Clara was nowhere to be found. 3 children. 3 graves, though only one body lay beneath the earth. The Wilton family was unraveling, consumed by something that should never have existed. The photograph, the whispers, the losses. All tied together in a web of darkness that no one dared to name aloud. But the tragedy was not finished yet. The photograph still remained, and with it, a promise that something worse was still to come. The year was 1912, and the Wilton tragedy had already stolen 3 children from the household, 1 to death, 2 to the unknown. The town whispered, the church bells rang too often, and the family portrait sat in its drawer like a wound that refused to close. But then, it vanished. Thomas was the first to notice. One night, unable to sleep, he crept downstairs, determined to burn the photograph once and for all. He lit a single candle, his hands trembling as he pulled open the drawer. The cloth was there. The drawer was there. But the photograph itself gone. At first, he thought Margaret had moved it. Or perhaps one of the children, though only Clara remained, trembling and sleepless in her mother's arms. But Margaret swore she hadn't touched it. And Clara, shaking her head violently, whispered, "He took it." The room grew colder with her words. The candle flickered as if a draft had swept through the sealed house. The missing portrait became an obsession. Thomas searched every corner of the home, beneath the floorboards, behind the stove, even in the rafters of the barn. It was nowhere. Margaret began to unravel, convinced the photograph had returned to where it came from, that it had never belonged to them in the first place. But within days, whispers spread through the town. The portrait had reappeared, not in the Wiltons' drawer, not even in their home, but in the possession of others. A shopkeeper swore he found the image tucked between pages of his account book, though he had never seen it before. A farmer claimed his daughter discovered it beneath her pillow, folded neatly as though placed there by unseen hands. A priest in the village chapel declared he discovered it nailed to the inside of the church door, staring out at him with its blurred figure, before it faded like mist when he touched it. The disturbing image was moving through the town, unbound by drawer, frame, or owner. Wherever it appeared, strange events followed. Livestock refused to eat. Infants cried through the night. A woman fainted after looking too long, swearing she saw her dead brother's face in the blurred figure. It was as if the photograph no longer belonged to one family. It had chosen to belong to everyone. The villagers panicked. They gathered in whispers at the edge of the chapel ruins, debating what to do. Some argued it must be destroyed, burned, buried, ripped apart. Others insisted it was too dangerous, that meddling with it would only bring further tragedy. One elder said the portrait was never meant to exist, that it was an echo of the dead demanding to be heard. But no matter what they decided, the photograph defied them. Attempts to destroy it ended in failure. One man claimed he tossed it into the fire, only to find it lying on his windowsill the next morning, untouched by flame. Another swore he buried it deep in the woods, but days later, children found it pinned to the wooden gate of the Wilton house, as though it had returned home on its own. And still, the Wiltons suffered. Margaret was seen wandering the road at night, clutching her locket and muttering Alice's name. Thomas aged years in weeks, his face hollow, his eyes haunted. Clara barely spoke, staring instead at empty corners, as though waiting for someone to appear. The town grew restless, convinced now that the Wiltons had unleashed something on them all, and perhaps they were right. For every time the portrait appeared, it seemed more corrupted, its surface darker, its shadows deeper. The blurred figure became sharper, more defined, its face slowly forming into something almost human. Almost, but not quite. And then, as suddenly as it had spread, the portrait vanished again. No villager claimed to have seen it. No household whispered of its presence. Weeks passed without sight of the cursed image. The town tried to breathe again, convincing themselves it was finished, that whatever force had bound itself to the photograph had finally retreated back into the grave. The Wiltons were left in silence, grief-stricken, but spared of new horrors. But they were wrong. For one night, Clara awoke screaming. Margaret rushed to her bedside, only to find the child pointing at the mirror on the wall. And there it was, the photograph. Not printed on paper, not resting in a drawer, but reflected in the glass itself, as if the mirror had become its new frame. The Wiltons' faces stared out, the blurred figures standing clearer than ever beside them, smiling faintly, as though it had finally stepped into the world it had been waiting for. The photograph had not disappeared. It had only changed where it lived. The year was 1912, and the Wilton tragedy seemed sealed within the dust of history. 3 children gone. A household consumed. A town forever scarred by whispers of the dead, and a photograph that moved as if alive. For decades, the story lingered only in hushed conversations and half-forgotten records. Yet time, rather than burying it, has only deepened the mystery. In recent years, researchers of dark history and paranormal scholars have returned to the tale of the Wiltons. They sift through brittle pages of forgotten events, combing archives for evidence of the disturbing image. And what they have uncovered has raised questions too chilling to ignore. One theory suggests the photograph was a form of post-mortem photography, a common yet unsettling practice in the 19th and early 20th century. Families often posed their dead children among the living, painted open eyes on eyelids, or propped bodies upright with hidden stands. Could the blurred sixth figure have been Alice, Henry, or Clara, captured after death and later mistaken for the supernatural? It's possible. But skeptics point out the flaw. The blurred figure was never a child the family had lost. It was someone else. Someone they never named. Other scholars lean into folklore. The Wiltons' village, like so many forgotten places, was steeped in superstition. Whispered tales of spirits who clung to families, of revenants who demanded remembrance, and of mirrors that held the dead, not the living. Perhaps the photograph acted as a vessel, a forbidden language written not in words, but in captured light. Some even argue it was an act of sympathetic magic, that by photographing the family together, something else forced itself into the frame, tying its fate to theirs. But the most unsettling theories are the modern ones. Several researchers claim the story of the Wilton portrait is not isolated. Across the world, scattered in archives and attics, there exist photographs with similar anomalies. Extra hands, blurred faces, figures that do not belong. In some cases, the families tied to these photographs also suffered tragedy, vanished children, mysterious disappearances, houses left abandoned. These disturbing images, when compared, suggest a pattern. Could the Wiltons have been one of many? Could their photograph have been part of a larger chain of cursed images, forgotten by history, but connected by something sinister? Some go further still. Digital analysts, who have scanned the only surviving copy of the Wilton portrait, claim to hear faint whispers in the static of the file, voices buried deep in the data, as though the curse itself survived the transition from paper to pixels. Paranormal investigators insist the image is not just an artifact, but a haunted object that adapts to whatever medium contains it. And then come the parallels. Those who study the Wiltons' fate often note eerie resemblances to modern cases. Families torn apart by unexplained tragedies. Children who claim to see the other boy or the woman in the corner. Homes where photographs fall from the walls in the night, shattering without cause. Even online, rumors spread of cursed digital photographs that appear uninvited in photo galleries or of faces emerging in live streams where no one should be present. It is as if the Wilton portrait was not a closed story, but the first page of an unsettling history still being written. And while skeptics dismiss these claims as exaggerations, too many parallels remain to ignore. Too many families with similar scars. Too many unsettling histories lost in time. But perhaps the most disturbing parallel of all is this. No one knows where the original photograph went. After the Wiltons' downfall, the trail goes cold. Some insist it was buried with Margaret, who clutched her locket to the grave. Others claim it was hidden away by priests, locked in vaults to keep it from spreading further. And some whisper that it still exists, waiting in an attic, a museum, or even a private collection, ready to be uncovered again. And if the photograph truly adapts to its time, if it survives across generations, what if it has already resurfaced? What if it already hides among us, its eerie details disguised in the flood of old photos we scroll past each day? A family portrait that shouldn't exist. A tragedy that shouldn't be repeated. Yet the shadows of 1912 may not be buried at all. They may be closer than we think. The year was 1912, but its shadow never truly faded. The story of the Wiltons did not end with the graves of Alice and Thomas, nor with the vanished children whose bodies were never found. It lingered, etched into the collective memory of a town that eventually collapsed under its own fear, and in a photograph that should never have existed. Generations have passed, but whispers remain. Locals tell of the Wilton home, long abandoned, its walls sagging, its windows shattered. They say on certain nights, if the moonlight hits just right, you can see figures moving in the glass panes, faces too blurred to recognize, but too human to dismiss. Some claim the house breathes, as though the walls themselves remember every sob, every prayer, every whispered word that was ever spoken inside. The haunting legacy of the family portrait lies not only in its eerie details, but in what it represents. The fragility of memory, the terror of loss, and the possibility that some photographs capture more than mere faces. They capture what should not be seen. They capture what should not remain. Modern historians call the Wilton tragedy a cautionary tale of superstition and grief. Skeptics dismiss it as folklore, a story woven by frightened villagers. But believers, those who study the unsettling history of haunted places and disturbing images, argue otherwise. They insist the Wilton portrait was one of many cursed relics scattered across time, artifacts that tether the living to the dead. And even now, over a century later, the portrait story is not closed. There are reports of copies resurfacing in forgotten archives, of collectors whispering about a photograph too dangerous to display. Some insist that when magnified, the blurred figure reveals more each decade, its face sharpening, its form solidifying, as though it is still trying to emerge. Perhaps the Wiltons were not cursed by chance. Perhaps they were chosen, or perhaps the camera, that new invention of their time, opened a door never meant to be unlocked. After all, what is photography but the act of freezing shadows? And what happens when the shadows decide they do not wish to remain still? The haunting legacy of the Wilton family is not confined to the past. Look closely, and you will see it echo in the present, in the photographs that fall from the wall without cause, in the faces that appear in mirrors when you stand alone, in the digital images that glitch, forming shapes no one can explain. The Wilton portrait was said to vanish, to reappear, to move where it pleased. If that is true, then who is to say it has not already returned? Who is to say it is not hidden now among the countless old photos that surface in online auctions, or pass silently from collector to collector, carrying its curse forward into the modern age? And if you ever find yourself staring at a photograph that feels wrong, one that makes your skin crawl, one that seems to whisper when the room is silent, remember the Wiltons. Remember 1912. And ask yourself, is it only paper and ink you're looking at? Or is it something alive? The family portrait that shouldn't exist still casts its shadow. It is a reminder that some stories refuse to die, that some faces never fade, and that the line between memory and haunting is far thinner than we wish to believe. So, when you look at your own family photographs, be cautious. Look closely at the edges, at the shadows, at the places where the image blurs. Ask yourself, is everyone in the picture truly meant to be there? Because once you notice an extra face, it may already be too late. This is the end of the story. But the whispers remain, and perhaps they are closer than you think.